job.
She did. Well, Penelope helped her. I mean, incredible.
Yeah. Nobody can see behind me.
Did Laura show up?
Yeah, hey, Laura.
Hi, Laura. I didn't see you. I didn't know you made it. Should we?
The vertical challenge.
Good evening. Is that on? Is that on now? Good evening. Good evening. I think we probably want to get the program started. Good evening. My name is Tom Lee. I'm chairman of Mountain Travel Sobek, MT Sobek, as you'll see in some of the material that you've received. I've had the privilege of knowing of Richard for over 50 years, but actually getting to become a partner with him over 30 years ago. And so I have the pleasure of introducing him tonight. When we think of Richard, we think of somebody who's more than an adventurer. He's a pioneer who's kind of redefined what active travel is. One of the things that they call him is the father of the modern adventure travel. Richard has spent decades pursuing boundaries that are possible both physically and in storytelling, and he's very good at storytelling. He graduated from Northwestern University in 1972. He and the co-founder of Sobek, John Yost, were young college graduates who had no idea what they wanted to do. So they founded Sobek, which became obviously the first multinational river running company with over 50 first descents throughout the world, including the Yangtze in China and the Zambesi in Southern Africa. The interesting thing is, last September, we had a 50th reunion party in Salmon, Idaho, and we had 150 people show up for that. Many of them old guides who were talking about their 50 first ascent, or parts of the different ascents that they made throughout the world. And you know, in these times, to listen to them was truly a special experience. In the early 90s, Sobek and Mountain Travels merged together, bringing together probably at that point the largest international adventure travel company, eco travel company in the world. Richard's impact extends beyond river excursions. He's obviously a prolific writer with over 19 books that he's written. He's also has articles and essays in a multitude of publications, including the New York Times. In 2004, he started a PBS series called Adventure with a Purpose. That ran for about 9 years, and I'm sure you can find some of the reruns on YouTube. Obviously, he was also an early adapter to the internet, being behind things like Expedia, all the Microsoft platforms that were back in the day that were like Slate and MSNBC and Yahoo Media. But the interesting thing about Richard is his adventures are not just about adrenaline rushes. They're really cultural he talks about cultural immersion, he talks about personal growth, and he talks about environmental awareness. He champions, obviously, responsible travel and believes in using travel both as a force of good and change throughout the world. Richard's story is one of, obviously, curiosity, boundless energy, and a deep connection to the natural world. He inspires all of us to challenge ourselves and embrace new experiences and see the world with a set of fresh eyes. I invite all of you tonight to explore your own sense of adventure as Richard speaks about his, whether it's through travel, creative pursuits, or simply stepping outside your comfort zones. With that, I'll introduce Richard.
Wow, thank you, Tom. I don't think I need to say anything at this point after that. Well, We might as well just jump into it. Are you ready to get wet? Okay. So that was obviously that was taken with a Super 8 camera. That was in 1987, and that was the first descent of the Great Bend of the Yangtze River. It was at the time one of the great geographical races. The Chinese called it the Mount Everest of rivers, and were for a time offering. I started canvassing the Chinese in the 70s to see if we could run this great river, and was summarily turned down many, many times for many years. And finally they came back and they recognized they could sell a permit to go down the Yangtze to be the first, as they have sold several of their mountains. And their fee for to be the first was $1 million. And it didn't include hotel rooms or transfers. We couldn't afford that. We tried to find sponsors and such. It didn't work out. And there was a group out of Oregon that actually got the first permit. At the same time, the Chinese were trying to do their own expedition, and they put together 3 separate groups because they wanted to own this prize. The group from Oregon went first, and they had a photographer from National Geographic on board, and he died on the trip from altitude sickness. And the trip was aborted. There was a mutiny on the trip. The trip was aborted and didn't get very far. The Chinese tried to do it, but their expertise in this sort of thing was lacking, and they ended up losing 14 people in various attempts in various rapids and cliffs. So we came in with a much smaller fee. At this point, it was down to $350,000, and we were able to raise that money through some sponsors and some clients who wanted to join this trip. So we did it, and we made it. we did the first full descent of the great bend of the Yangtze River. Came out of it with a few scratches and bumps and bruises, but it was one in what became a catalog of first descents of rivers around the world, as Tom alluded to. But I thought I'd go from the past to something present. Last year, I went to Angola, and this is a monument that is commemorating the 17-year civil war that pitted the West versus the East. It was a proxy war, and the U.S. was involved with South Africa versus Russia and Cuba and the Angolans. It was settled finally in 2002, and the country has been peaceful since. But during the war, over 500,000 Angolans died, and much of the fighting took place in the eastern highlands, which happens to be the water table for some of the great rivers of Africa. And during that time, they laid down an estimated 2 million landmines. So nobody has dared venture to this area since 2002 until we put together a trip last year, and we did this for a specific reason. First, I'm going to show you just a few-second clip of what the terrain looks like in what they call the water tower of eastern Angola. So it's by helicopter that we chartered out of Botswana. So this is the Okavango River, and that's the source of the Okavango Delta. And because of the landmines, the sort of irony of the landmine situation is that it kept the area free of development and human presence during the Civil War and since. So the water has run clear and full into the Okavango Delta, which, of course, is one of the greatest cradles of biodiversity on the planet. It has the largest concentration of elephant in the world, 130,000 elephant. And it is very critical to the GDP of Botswana. About 11% of the GDP comes from tourism in Botswana. And it is a place that not only has this record number of elephant, but it also has towers of giraffe, dazzles of zebra, bloats of hippos, crashes of rhino, confusions of guinea fowl, flamboyances of flamingo. I love these words. And about 1 million humans who run the eco lodges and our support systems throughout the region. The reason we did this trip is the Chinese have come in, as they have in many countries in Africa, and proposed a series of dams on the upper Okavango River. And if they persuade the Angolan government that this is a wise thing to do, it could very well turn off the spigot that has the water that runs into the delta itself. And we thought, and we partnered with National Geographic on this project, we thought that if we could prove that tourism would be a viable alternative, a sustainable alternative to this dam building, that maybe the Angolan government would look at that as a possibility. And all they had to do is look south to Botswana to see how successful their tourism propositions have been. So we organized the first trip by helicopter to come and visit the headwaters of the Okavango Delta. And this was our campsite, the first tents, I think, ever in this particular area. We had sappers, landmine diffusers who were with us, who made sure that we didn't step in the wrong place. And the area is being cleared. So we hope that this is an adventure with purpose. We hope it's something that can change the dynamic of that part of the world. Something that I think is a mission for the company, and it has been since its beginnings. Talk about beginnings. I started rafting in the Potomac River, where I grew up, when I was, I'm guessing, 12 in this picture. I sort of understood back then the sort of wisdom of uncertainty and the ferocious ambiguity of what lies downstream, and that attracted me to rivers, essentially. I bought my first canoe, I think when I was 17, $35. You can see some of the dents on the canoe. It was well used, and I became with my friend Ricky Verbuchen, very good canoeists. We belong to a group called the Canoe Cruisers Association, which is a fantastic group in the Washington, D.C. area where a lot of bureaucrats will throw their ties off in the weekends and go barreling down the many rivers of the Appalachian Mountains and the Shenandoahs and the Blue Ridge. And I did all of them. I was an active member in the club and thought that I was pretty good, pretty trick. So I entered their annual canoe race, which goes from Great Falls down to a place called Sycamore Island. And we were way out front. We thought we were going to slam this thing and come home with the trophy. And we were a bit arrogant, perhaps, because we capsized about a half mile. We hit a rock, capsized about a half mile. We were out front before the finish line. And we got back in the canoes, and we were dripping wet. And this was the period when people were streaking a lot. So you probably can't tell, but we crossed the finish line naked. And there was a reporter from the Washington Post there who took a photo that ended up on the cover of the Washington Post. This is that photo, so you can see it discreetly covers something, but somebody in the club was not happy. And she essentially demanded that I be kicked out or suspended from the Canoe Cruisers Association. Luckily, the chair of the club decided to defend me and let me remain in the club, which turned out to be a wonderful decision because this group, the Canoe Cruisers Association, a few weeks after this, went to the Grand Canyon and did the first C1 descent with open canoes of the Grand Canyon, of the Colorado through the Grand Canyon. I did not go. I couldn't afford to go, but they came back and they showed me the Super 8 film of their descent, and I was overwhelmed. I'd never seen anything like that anywhere on the East Coast. So big, so radical, so beautiful. It was like a Spielberg film unspooling in front of my eyes. I said, I have to go. So I wrote a letter to the outfitter for that expedition, a man named Ted Hatch River Expeditions. And I in my letter, I said, look, you know, I'm an accomplished paddler. I named several rivers that I knew existed on the West Coast as well as the East Coast. So I said, oh, yeah, I've been down the Green, I've been down the White, I've been down you know, the Snake. There's a Snake River out here. And he was sufficiently impressed that he hired me through the mail. Came out, I think he was a little disappointed when he saw me, but I then became a river guide at the age of 18, became a river guide on the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. Very different water than here on the East Coast. Too thick to drink and too thin to plow, they used to say. But it was a transformational experience for me. The axis of my identity spun in new directions that didn't allow turning back. I was going to school at Northwestern in the winter times and felt awkward, felt shy, not particularly socially adept, and I don't think academically anything stellar. But I would come to the Colorado and suddenly became a very different person. It was strange in that I suddenly found myself taking some very extraordinary people down this river. This was the early days of river rafting. It didn't really exist anywhere else besides the Colorado through the Grand Canyon and a couple of other rivers on the west. Prior to 1959, less than 100 people had traveled down the Colorado through the Grand Canyon. And by 1969, when I started, the numbers weren't that much bigger. So Hatch, first of all, had a hard time finding guides, so I was lucky. But two, the type of person that went there was really somebody who would have been a member of the Explorers Club, who was ready to try something that was new and different and challenging, and had unknowns about it. So I remember I took down the president of MGM, Bo Polk, and I was regaled by his tales of Julie Andrews, his one-time girlfriend, and her escapades. And then I took down the editor-in-chief of the Chicago Tribune, and I was thinking, you know, I could never meet him at Northwestern. There's no way I could get into his office, but to be one-on-one with him around the campfire, trading stories, and then he and others asking me, you know, how do I set up a tent, or how do I do this, or what's the weather going to be? Suddenly it gave me a sense of confidence and clarity that I lacked up until that point. And this happened to a lot of guides. They found, I think, sort of an inner strength just by guiding. And it was a truly remarkable for me transformation. While I was guiding, and I guided for 7 seasons, I was presented with a brochure that somebody had picked up or had been sent in the mail, and it came from National Geographic, and it was, join us for the first descent of the Omo River in Ethiopia, the river trip of the century. They were charging $3,000 a person to join this expedition. And I thought, well, I should be a guide on this particular trip. There's probably few, I think, that could guide as well as I. The outfitter was a man named Ron Smith from Grand Canyon Expeditions, who had taken Geographic on a trip down the Colorado, and a feature came out of it a few years before, and they had hired him. So I got a drive-away car and drove to Kanab, Utah, and I presented myself to Ron Smith and said, I think I'm the best guide there is. I would like to join this expedition. So he looked at me and he said, you know, I think you're a little bit too skinny for an expedition of this nature. Why don't you see if you can do something about that and come back in 6 months? So I did. I went back to Northwestern, and I enrolled at the gym, and I drank protein shakes, worked out every day, and I came back 6 months later, and I felt like I was Rocky at that point, more buff than I'd ever been, or have been since probably. And I sat down, I said, Ron, I'm ready. I really want to do this expedition. And he goes, oh, I'm sorry, I gave the last seat to my brother. So he's going to be on it. So sorry, you can't come. I was pissed. So next to me, on my right, is John Yost. We were high school friends, actually, and I brought him on the river. He was my swamper. And his father happened to be the DCM, the Deputy Chief of Mission of Ethiopia at the time. And I said, John, you know, what do you think about us doing this ourselves? And he goes, that's a great idea. I think we could pull that off. So, you know, we had this vague idea you should get sponsors, and we went after sponsors. We got a rafting company to donate rafts, a life jacket company. We got a magazine, a men's magazine called Saga, to give us film and guarantee that we would write an article. And I knew the Smithsonian was involved in expeditions, and I lived in D.C., so I went to the Smithsonian. They said, listen, why don't you go to the entomology department? They often get involved in things like this. So I went. A man named Dr. Spangler, never forget, said, boy, we would love to have a collection of insects from that region. We have nothing. This is great. And he goes, what do you call yourselves? To that point, we had called ourselves the Raw Expedition, which we thought was clever because it stood for Reconnaissance of African Waterways. It also was a key off of Thor Heyerdahl's documentary film that was in theaters at the time called the Ra, R-A, Expedition after the Egyptian sun god, where he was trying to take a papyrus boat across the Atlantic and failed. But lastly, everybody was streaking, including me. David Niven had hosted the Academy Awards, and a streaker went behind him. 150 million people watched as a streaker went by. So we thought, the Raw expedition, that's great. Dr. Spangler looked at me in horror, took me aside and said, I'm sorry, the Smithsonian cannot sponsor the Raw expedition. You got to change your name. So I went to the Library of Congress and I started researching to see if I could come up with a name. I've researched all these different ways you could die on a river in Africa from these tropical diseases, onchocerciasis, schistosomiasis, blackwater fever, a long list. And then all the wildlife, they're hyenas, lion, of the 10 most poisonous snakes in the world, 13 are in Ethiopia. And they have these roaming bands of bandits called Shifta that have attacked previous attempts to do something in Ethiopia. The British Army had made an attempt and failed. But the one thing that resonated the most was reading stories about the crocodiles. And I didn't realize at the time, that's me on the left, lower. I had an affinity for reptiles. This is in first grade. So I read about Sobek, the ancient Egyptian crocodile god of the Nile, who would give safe passage to people who properly gave him homage. So we named the company Sobek, and that was our imprimatur, going forward, and MT Sobek today, after 50 years. We made it over to Africa, to Ethiopia. We first did a descent of the Awash River as a warm-up to the Omo. It was remarkable in its white water, as you can see, but also it's lined with a group of people called the Danakil. You may have heard of them, but they're considered among the fiercest of the tribes people in Africa. They have a long-time ritual where when you reach manhood, or in order to be recognized that you've reached manhood, you have to go out and collect a testicular trophy from one of your enemies. And then you would wear this around your belt. So as we traveled down the river, we would see these people with their trophies around their belts and their spears and break out harmonicas and try to make them smile so we would not be perceived as a threat. One, when we came to a portage, came down, raced down to our boats as we were trying to move them around a waterfall. And we were fearful as to what might happen next, but he came down and he helped pick up the boat and moved it around the falls. So our experiences worked out well. From there, we trekked to the Omo. It was a river unlike any I had ever seen before. It was like the Colorado, but with three-dimensional chess, in that not only was it a beautiful canyoned river, very similar to the Colorado, to the Grand Canyon, very big river, runs into Lake Turkana in northern Kenya, but it was also full of wildlife, all the wildlife of Africa, and peoples who had rarely, if ever, seen outsiders. The Bodhi and Mercy were two of these tribes people. And 4,000 hippos we counted on the first trip. We also learned that you don't want to get close to a baby hippo because the mother is ferocious and will give an oral reprimand if you are too close. So we lost a few boats to hippos. Very often, because the river is muddy, you'd be rowing along and the boat would lift up a few inches beneath you, because hippos can hold their breath for about 15 minutes and then they would come up to catch a breath and they don't know where they're going to come up and they come up into the raft, which was always a heady feeling. And you can see the size of their teeth, and they do some significant damage. But we've probably lost 10 rafts to hippos over the years, over the 50 years. we've pretty much learned the behavior and how to avoid them as much as possible. But on the first trip, Dr. George Fuller, my good friend, was frustrated because he never got a good photograph of a crocodile. We took croc rocks with us. So whenever a crocodile got close, we would fire a rock, a baseball-sized rock that we carried with us. And they were skittish, and they would dive, and we wouldn't see them again. He asked if he could prove that he was in Africa and get a good shot of a crocodile, and asked us not to throw any rocks the next time one charged. So we did. We let him film as this one crocodile approached and wrapped his teeth around George's boat. And George screamed. I was in the boat right behind him, jumped to the oars, and the crocodiles have one-directional jaws. They only can close like an iron trap, but they can't open them up very easily. They easily can get stuck. They claim you can put a rubber band around them. I've never tested that. But so the crocodile was stuck on the raft, and he was wagging it like a dog wagging a rag or something. And I'm trying to catch up with George, but he's hydroplaning downstream. He is so fast. And his wife, Diane Fuller, takes a bucket, a metal bucket, jumps to the bow of the boat where the croc was attached and starts banging it over the head. And finally, the crocodile rips itself loose. And we made it to shore. We spent 2 days patching the boat and continued downstream. So I went back to Geographic after we finished our trip. Well, we gave a presentation at USIS, the first public presentation of anything we'd ever done before. And then I went back to DC, and I walked in to the headquarters, went to the reception desk and said, look, I'd like to talk to Bill Graves. He was the managing editor at the time in charge of this expedition that they were going to do 3 months hence. And she goes, do you have an appointment? No. I'm sorry, you have to make an appointment. I said, well, can you call him and tell him I just got back from the Omo? She did. And suddenly he rushes down and escorts me up to a conference room with a big screen. And he calls in Gil Grosvenor, who was the editor at the time. And they call in all these executives, and I throw my slides up and show them the entire first descent of the Omo River, including the crocodiles and hippos. And they're aghast because they've sold this trip out. They've scheduled it to be the cover story for their Christmas issue. And I go, look, you're welcome to use any of my slides, and I'm happy to go with you. And they escorted me out to the front and said, we'll call you. And they never did. And they did their expedition. Alan Root was their photographer, who was probably the top African photographer at the time. But they did it the wrong time of year. They did it during flood season. Bad timing on their part. So all the wildlife was gone. All the peoples had gone to the highlands during the rainy season. And they capsized. And Alan Root lost his cameras and all his film. So when I heard that, I called Bill Graves again, and I said, look, you can use my photos. But nothing happened. Cut to 30 years later, and MT Sobek got the contract, which we ran for about 10 years, of running National Geographic Adventures. So the relationship was repaired after 30 years. So when I gave that presentation at USIS, afterwards, a gentleman came up to me, and he said he was at the palace. And that for insurance purposes, they needed somebody to photograph the royal jewels, and asked if I would consider. I mean, they clearly liked the photographs more than Geographic did. He was impressed, so he asked if I would come over to Haile Selassie's palace and photograph the jewels. I did. I brought my tripod, I brought my Minolta, I set it up, and they had a table, a long table with the jewels, and I'm photographing them, and there's several factotums surrounding me. Somebody rushes in the room, says something in Amharic, the local language, and they all run out, and they leave me there by myself with the royal jewels. So, and I go, what am I going to do? I'm waiting there. And I said, well, I'll take a picture of myself on Haile Selassie's bed. So I turned the camera around, and hence that shot. So, so this is our very first brochure that we created. So we started operating trips to the Omo River on a regular basis, and then we decided this is such a cool thing. Originally, this was going to be a last Yahoo before getting serious and going back to school, but this was just too much to turn our backs on. So we created a brochure, and we started to sell trips to Africa. This was the Blue Nile, and we did a section. The British had attempted to run the Blue Nile before us, but they had failed. So we were able to run a section that they had missed successfully in 1973. There's a very hellacious section above here, right below the Blue Nile Falls, that had never been attempted. And we went back in 75 to attempt that. And I started Sobek actually with two partners, John Yost, you saw earlier, and a man named Lou Greenwald. So this is the last picture of Lou. He drowned on the Blue Nile in 1975 on that trip. And that sent me, of course, into a tailspin. Suddenly everything that seemed beautiful and bright seemed dark and gloomy. I hung up my life jacket. I no longer was an evangelist for this type of activity. I thought it can do awful things. And I went to graduate school. And I buried myself in studies and tried to ignore the allure of river running and rafting and exploration. But my friends would come through and stay at my apartment on their way to run a river. And every time they came through with their optimism, their enthusiasm, their excitement, I couldn't help but feel that maybe I was missing something. Maybe I was seeing this the wrong way. I had read The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber, Hemingway's short story about a man who lives an existence that's dull and meaningless. But on a safari, he has a moment of courage and excitement as he tries to shoot a lion. The lion kills him in the short story, but he has a few seconds where he lives more than he ever had before, and it gives him everything he could ever want in life. And I sort of looked at what happened at this tragedy, as Lou had been 3 years with me with this company, exploring rivers and adventures, and it was the richest 3 years of his life. So I went on from there, and we organized more expeditions around the world. We did the first descent of the Zambesi. The Zambesi runs between Zambia and what was then Rhodesia. When it emerged as black majority rule Zimbabwe in 1981, we organized the first expedition. A lot of press was there. National Geographic was there to cover it. New York Times, the London Times, and Kenneth Kaunda, the president of Zambia, came to launch the expedition. One of his aides came to me the night before and asked me to write Kenneth Kaunda's speech because he had no idea what was going on. So I did. It was the first and only time I've written a presidential speech, but then Sobek was littered throughout the speech. So, so I was leading the expedition, so I'm in the first boat. There's a bridge that crosses between Zambia and Zimbabwe up there, and Kenneth Kaunda, the president, and the media were all up there. And I get into the very first rapid, and I flip. And Kenneth Kaunda apparently turns to one of the media people and goes, "Is that the way they're supposed to do it?" Since then, this river corridor has become, I think, the most popular activity in that part of Africa. Thousands and thousands of people have rafted and raft the Zambezi River. From there, we went on a binge. As Tom said, we did first descents of over 50 rivers around the world, including many of the greats. The first descent of the Yangtze, you saw a clip of that. We did the first descent of the Indus in Pakistan. We did the first descent of the Euphrates and the Churu in Turkey. First descent of a river in Sumatra called the Alas. It runs through the largest orangutan game reserve in the world. I'm the one on the right. And the Zanskar in India, Ladakh, India, Little Tibet. And what we were doing did not go unnoticed. I was invited to speak at the Explorers Club in India. And Avinash Kohli, to the far right, was the president of the Explorers Club in India at the time. And Edmund Hillary was an honorary member, of course. He then, at that point, joined our advisory board, as did, we had several other, I think, well-knowns in this particular space. Doug Tompkins joined our advisory board, Yvonne Chenard, Royal Robbins, and others. So it was a heady time to be associating with and conferring with and getting counsel from a lot of people that I looked up to in a very grand way. It was here in this club in 1974. We made a film of the Omo River expedition, and I showed it here. And I met Lowell Thomas, who was the president of the club at the time. And I asked Lowell Thomas, I said, we've done a lot in Africa and other parts of the world. Where would you recommend we go? And he goes, New Guinea. You have to go to New Guinea. So we did. We followed his advice. And we've been to many expeditions to New Guinea over the years. I have been working on a film with Peter Guber, a producer and owner of the old Golden State Warriors. He produced a film called Gorillas in the Mist years ago that made a difference. The gorillas were close to being wiped out. And the film was such a success, it won several Academy Awards, that he believes that that film helped influence hearts and minds and set up several nonprofits and others, and motivated tourists to visit the mountain gorillas. Sorry. So he said, why don't we do something about original cultures? So we went to New Guinea, and this is a film that's not done yet, but I thought I'd show you a little clip from it as we go towards trying to finish this film. It's about how first world cultures crash into original cultures.
The biggest problem we have in this country is greed and jealousy. White lies and cheating and commission and guns. No matter where you go, you can pan for gold. It's here.
The missionaries, the business people, the gold miners come in the name of progress. And then we realize that these changes are drowning our cultures.
Guns now have played an important part of power struggling. There's 850 nations, 850 tribes, 850 languages. They're always fighting each other. He killed about 17 in one village alone, persistently attacked him. They're just trying to survive.
We are worried because we have our culture, which we always wanted to maintain.
We're teaching God's word. If there are elements of a culture that are just in direct opposition to what we're teaching, then we encourage change.
The missionaries have come in and been instrumental in killing a lot of the culture in this country.
Something white man came and said now. Something like that.
Well, it started with the first pioneers come through.
I'm just so scared that I'm gonna lose my culture and everything.
In 10 years' time, this culture will die.
There's the drip feeding of Western society and education and health, still tapering off with custom.
It's almost like this culture has been under attack since first contact.
So many cultures around the world have been decimated because one culture comes and dominates.
Anyway, that's a work in progress. Another river we did in Guinea was called the Wagi, the Eater of Men. And this is my one chance to be an action hero. We had a boat, we did this as a BBC special. They had a series called River Journeys, and they wanted a first descent. So we sold them on the idea of doing the first descent of the Eater of Men, the Wagi. And we got to a very big rapid, and one of the boats capsized. And it's barreling downstream with a lot of the gear. All the occupants made it to shore. And we had helicopters because we were shooting this for the BBC. So I got a helicopter to pick me up, take me downstream to the upside-down boat that was racing, as the cliche would have it, towards a waterfall. And I jumped out of the helicopter onto the back of the boat and wrestled it to shore, saved the day. So I've never been that heroic since or before. So. So I was, as Tom alluded, I was always interested in how digital media might help us communicate what we thought were the merits of adventure travel. And in the early 90s, when the first graphical user interface browser became available from the University of Illinois with Mark Andreessen, I read about a group in Sebastopol, California, called O'Reilly and Associates, run by Tim O'Reilly, who is a well-regarded technologist. And he started a rival to Mosaic called GNN, the Global Network Navigator. So I drove to Sebastopol, and I spent several days with Tim. And together, we cobbled together what I think, to this day, nobody's challenged me yet on this, we created the first travel website, which was www.mtsobek.com. It exists to this day. And with that, we started to utilize all the different techniques that the internet, the dawn of the internet allowed, including doing virtual expeditions. So it had always been frustrating to me to create these beautiful catalogs where you would have a 2-week extraordinary, overwhelming experience reduced to a couple of paragraphs and maybe 1 or 2 thumbnail photos. But of course, with the internet, we could suddenly bring somebody to a destination and showcase what it's really like and show the multidimensionality of it all. You had sound for the first time, so you could hear the crunch of ice under your crampons. You could hear the roar of a lion. You could hear gamelan music. All these things that I think moved you closer to trying to reach out and experience something like this for yourself. So we did a virtual expedition to Antarctica. And the first time anybody had ever done this, so we took all the apparatus with us, and we, for 2 weeks, communicated with the world. And we had live chats. I remember there was somebody came in and said, how are the polar bears? And said, that's why we're doing this, is to show you that Antarctica is different than the North Pole. And it was a big success. I came back and I got a call from a woman named Melinda French. I had no idea who she was. And she said, look, I'm at Microsoft. I'd love to fly you up and talk to you about an idea we have. So I flew up, and then I discovered that she was Melinda French Gates, had just married Bill. And they wanted to do something similar via the internet. And so they asked if I would take a leave of absence from MT Sobek. I remember calling you, Tom, about that. And you tried to talk me out of it, but Melinda kept upping the antes. So I went and I created a product called Mungo Park. And the idea was that you could travel around the world and communicate what was happening in real time. We did the first descent of the Yangtze River back to Ethiopia, to our origins, which runs the deepest gorge in Africa. Covered this completely, full multimedia as we traveled down this river for Mungo Park, part of Microsoft. Got a lot of media attention. I ended up in People magazine for what we were doing. And we took people, Microsoft had extraordinary budgets back then. So we took a lot of well-known people. We would approach them. I would approach them and say, look, what is your passion? We would love to partner with you and help you fulfill your passion as long as we can broadcast it via the internet. So here is a little sampling of what we did. See if it starts by itself here, or do I have to click it?
Travel is transformational, and there's no question that those who take this journey are different when they emerge than when they left. This is Richard Bangs, Editor-in-Chief. Welcome to Mungo Park. Mungo Park is a province of the improbable, a land of liquid names and unreal faces. Mungo Park has gone to space and done the first live chats from the space shuttle. How do the astronauts or the cosmonauts keep themselves clean?
Fortunately, in space, liquids adhere to surfaces, so it doesn't take as much water.
The finely crafted words of the world's greatest authors can be read as they tell their tales from distant borders.
This is Robert Shear, reporting from Hanoi, a city I last visited 27 years ago when bombs were dropping all around, where buildings were destroyed, where you crawled into a little hole in the sidewalk and pulled a manhole over your head out of fear.
And we explored the rivers and rainforests coast to coast on an eco tour of Costa Rica with actress Sherry Belafonte and the president of Costa Rica.
Hi, Mungo Park. It's Sherry Belafonte calling from Tortuguera, where this morning we got lucky. We went in and we saw the baby turtles hatching. It was so fabulous. A thrilling experience. Tomorrow, first thing in the morning at 6 a.m., we are off to Turrialba, where we're going to hunt volcanoes.
Dr. Ruth in the Trobrians, a matrilineal society, a place where the women rule, and a place where Dr. Ruth uncovered some new insights.
Mungo Park, this is Dr. Ruth Westheimer, and here is lesson number 1. Never come to these magnificent islands, which they call islands of love, without bringing somebody where there is a potential of a love affair.
One of the precepts of Mungo Park is...
So I'm going to... we're running a little bit over, so I'm going to skip some of this and move forward, but I want you to hear this one, at least a portion of it. One of the coolest things we did at Mungo Park was we wired up the astronauts in the Endeavour, the space shuttle, and it was the first time they'd ever been wired up, and we did live chats from space. But we also had them call in to Click and Clack, the Car Talk guys, the Tappet brothers. So I'll play a little little bit of what transpired. when they
This
called.
next caller, this guy, you'd have to say was definitely out there. I mean, that would be a good way to describe him. Would you say?
Oh, yeah, he was out there all right, and it took us a while, but we eventually, even us,
It did take us a while, though. That's stupid.
we eventually caught on. Hello, you're on Car Talk.
Hello, Tom Ray. It's great to talk to you. This is John from Houston.
Hi, John.
John, we can barely hear you.
Okay, I'll speak up a little bit.
Oh, that's good.
I work for the government, so I can't tell you too much, but I occasionally drive this government vehicle. It's one of those Rockwell things.
Uh-huh.
And twice it's done a very funny thing, and I thought maybe you guys could help me with it.
What Rockwell thing?
You know, one of those Rockwell vans?
A van.
Anyway, the twice that I've driven this thing off the line, when I first started up, it starts great. It accelerates really, really well.
Yeah.
And it runs incredibly rough, though, for about 2 minutes. This is one of those puzzlers.
Yeah. Rough for 2 minutes.
After the first 2 minutes, after this really rough ride, there's kind of a jolt, and then it runs smooth, but only for about 6.5 more minutes. And then at that point, the engine dies.
The engine dies.
Yeah, it just stops completely.
Gee, you know, I hate to make any...
Two different vehicles by serial number, and both have done exactly the same thing.
Oh, these vehicles have serial numbers.
Well,
I mean, different vehicles.
I hate to be suspicious.
I'm suspicious also.
I hate to be suspicious, but the whole what would I call it? The sound coming from the telephone.
Yeah.
Sounds so familiar. I mean, I expect you to say.
I'm on the cellular.
Yeah, you sound like Tom Hanks saying, "Houston, we have a problem." Where are you calling from, John?
Just a second. Let me look. I'm about 200 miles north of Hawaii.
No. Really? No kidding. How did they fish you into this deal?
Oh, this is a good deal. In fact, I'm in the vehicle as we speak.
And it's probably running really quiet right now, huh?
Yeah, it's running pretty quiet, I'd say. We're still going pretty fast, but it's very quiet.
How fast are you going?
Oh, about 17,500 miles an hour.
Boy,
All right. That's good. Mungo Park lasted for a couple of years. It made no money, as you can imagine, but we did tap into the GDS, the Global Distribution System, which tracks and allows you to book all airline tickets. And we discovered that people who wanted to follow in the footsteps of many of these celebrities, and we were able to sell tickets to them. So Mungo Park was folded, and we started something called Microsoft Travel. The idea was to have a consumer-facing product that would allow people to digitally book hotels and airlines anywhere in the world. There was a problem in that the Justice Department was breathing down the neck of Microsoft, threatening to break it up at the time. So many considered Microsoft the Darth Vader of technology, and this was not going to be a good consumer-facing name. So we hired a branding company, and I was in the team to come up with the new brand. I think there were 3 of us. And the branding company, after several weeks of focus groups, came back and they gave us a list of names, but the one they liked the most was Expedia. So they made their presentation. I immediately wrote an email to Bill Gates saying, I think Expedia is a terrible name. It reminds me of an excommunicated priest who's having some sort of intimate experience with little boys. And Bill came back, shot back, and said, look, we just spent $75,000 on this branding. We're going to go with Expedia, and it's up to you to brand it. So I spent the next year sponsoring everything you could think of, from wrestling matches to bicycle races to the Marathon des Sables. And I also sponsored a PBS show called Smart Travels with Rudy Maxa. And we did that for several years. And then after I left Expedia and that sponsorship ended, PBS approached me and asked if I would do a series. So I did. I spent the next several years doing Adventures with Purpose, a PBS series. I'll show you a little clip of this, and then we'll race to the end. So. So I'm going to race through the rest here, but our mission of exploration, adventure, sharing adventures, sharing the interconnectedness of all things continues. And we've done many, many first rivers and well beyond rivers. So I led the first trip to Libya under Gaddafi, the first American trip since Gaddafi came into power. We did the first trips to Iran. You could see they were very welcoming. And for a while, we ran the New York Times journeys, and we did many trips to Iran for the New York Times. I did the first trip to North Korea. Spent probably 20 years trying to get permission to go to North Korea, and we finally got that permit. It took 22 people. I was in Sudan just this last year to see Meroe, the Black Pyramids in Nubia, in northern Sudan. And this legacy continues. We also did the first trips to Saudi Arabia before they had any tourism whatsoever. This was a crossing of the empty quarter. The first crossing of the empty quarter since 1948 when Wilfred Thesiger crossed it.
All right.
And I'm going to close with one last clip. And I urge you to pay attention to this particular clip because there's something I want to comment about it at the end. This is an IMAX film we made, harking back to our origins, Ethiopia. We did the first descent of the Nile River beginning in Ethiopia on the Blue Nile. The Blue Nile and the White conflude in Khartoum. And then the White Nile is a longer river, but the Blue Nile contributes about 5/6 of all the water that create the Nile proper. So this was an expedition from its source in Ethiopia, Lake Tana, all the way to Alexandria in Egypt. So, enjoy.
Flipping a raft in huge white water can be fatal. People can drown in a hurry if they hit their head on a rock or get snagged underwater. On earlier expeditions, at least 6 people have died in this one section alone.
Notice the color of the water.
That morning, Michel steered his raft right into my worst nightmare.
I did a perfect flip. Everybody, the 3 of us, went into the water.
which is crocodile. And I'm thinking, oh my God, there's a crocodile in the river.
And this was the first time on the entire expedition where I could actually feel the hair go up on the back of my neck.
We knew there could be crocodiles around it. Usually they wait in the rapids so they can catch the fish which go through the rapids. And we were big fishes.
Everyone in Michel's boat is lucky to be alive.
So I'm not sure if you noticed. In fact, this IMAX film has been out for a while, and I don't believe anybody's ever noticed, but the IMAX camera was actually strapped to the boat that capsized. So there was no record of that capsize, although it was among the most exciting moments of the entire 3-month expedition. So what we did, hence the color of the water, we went to the Skycomish River in Washington State and recreated that capsize. That's a combination of 7 different tries running down that one waterfall that's just off the road on the Skycomish River. So it's called the art of living dangerously, not the science of living dangerously. Because art, by some definitions, is an application of human creativity and imagination. And it takes, I think, that art to sometimes manage, create, and undergo these sorts of challenges, these expeditions, these adventures. There's always an art involved in making these things real and successful. So, of course, the lesson is things aren't always what they seem, but it's the story that counts. The last slide, just to summarize this. So Sobek celebrated its 50th anniversary last September. We had these cups made. My wife, Laura Huber, who's here in the audience, took the cup to her job at the Getty and had it on her desk. And a couple of companions came up to her and said, "Congratulations on being 50 years sober." So it's not always what it seems. So that's it. As you know, there are books and catalogs. The catalogs are complimentary. Please grab one on the way out if you don't have one, and please join us on a trip anywhere in the world. We'd love to have you with us. Amber is here too from the company. She was manning the desk out front. I guess we open it for questions at this point. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Adventure travel like this is so exciting because it opens up the world for the local residents who can see a new world for them economically, and it's exciting, of course, for the visitors. But I think in this era, we're all wrestling with the impact we have from a climate point of view about a bunch of Westerners coming in and, flying their jet airplanes, which produce a lot of carbon dioxide, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
What do we do? I mean, how do we be responsible travelers in this age and era?
You bring up a lot of points, and I think there are different answers to some of them. Firstly, the local economics can be fundamentally changed in a very positive way with what we do. The Zambesi is a great example. Livingston, Zambia was as poor as any place could be in Africa until we started operating trips there. We trained the locals. We brought some to the States and had them go through Whitewater School. Now, virtually all the guides are local Zambians, and they make a fantastic living. The tips are extraordinary, and they've been able to open up schools and clinics, and they've improved roads. It's an entirely different culture, a much improved culture, because of what we brought to that region. So I'm very proud of that. And that's been replicated. As far as contributions to climate change, I'm on the board of CREST, which is the Center for Responsible Travel in Washington, D.C. And it's something we wrestle with a lot. Our mandate from the very beginning has been small groups, responsible travel, and giving back and engaging. So not to be as many travelers, the mobile rich exacting themselves on the inert poor, but people who actually engage with the culture and try to exact some sort of understanding back and forth, which can make an enormous difference on both sides of that equation. Yes, in order to take many of our trips, to take a safari, you fly in a commercial airline and you contribute, but there are ways to offset if you're willing to do that as a customer. We're involved in a lot of nonprofit organizations that we give to with profits from the company. And we also are keenly aware that the airlines are also appreciate this issue and are working hard to alleviate it. So there are some airlines, Air New Zealand was the first to use biofuels. We do trips to New Zealand. And believe it or not, people have said this was impossible, but there are efforts being made to have solar air travel and a Tesla-like experience, an electric plane. So we'll see where that goes. But in the meantime, when you look at the large ledger of what we think we contribute to the health of the planet, to what happens when you take a long plane ride, I think it's better to travel than not. So, any other questions? Yes.
1 second, please wait for the microphone. Sorry.
So to a fledgling adventurer, somebody who's just trying to get their feet wet, what would you say is a good first step in that direction towards somebody who's just trying to get into it?
I mean, it's a very relative thing. For many people, a first camping trip can be a grand adventure. I remember Franny Leibowitz said, to get from my hotel to a cab when it's raining is a grand adventure for me. I tried to recruit her to take one of our trips, and that was her reply to me, actually. So yes, I mean, one of the points of adventure travel is to try to get outside of your comfort zone, because only then, if you challenge yourself, do you find new understandings, a different perspective, and some clarity, I think. So wherever you are in your adventure realm, it would be good to push it and try something different or something new. And it could be as simple as a walk in the woods, or it could be a trek in the Himalayas. It could be, rafting the Zambesi. But you can take a trip to any of the national parks. It's one thing that the company Mountain Travel Sobek offers, trips to most of the Western national parks. And those are fully guided and with interpreters and people that will hold your hand and make sure that you get the optimal experience out of it. And from there, you can lever upwards. And before you know it, you'll be on top of Mount Everest. Any others?
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for this amazing exposition of your travels and experiences. My question is, do you still feel fear on plus the adrenaline you feel on these trips? How do you deal with the challenges still doing it, knowing that you may capsize or not? Thanks.
I think your question is how do we deal with fear judiciously? I would, even though all of this looks really outrageous and crazy, insane perhaps, I certainly don't consider myself such. Everything that we've done and continue to do are well thought out and measured and researched from the very beginning. Yes, we made mistakes, and we learned from those mistakes. And I think our consciousness has evolved as a result of it. Fear in a healthy dose is a good thing. It does get the adrenaline moving, and it does activate certain neurons in the brain that can give you a better sense of well-being and identity. So, yes, I mean, that's what we offer, basically, is controlled fear. It's often called the sublime experience. So the sublime, the Romantic poets, defined as something that gives you both terror and pleasure at the same time. And that's what we offer.
Richard, in such a successful story, right, as an entrepreneur, as a company, as a writer, as a storyteller, what was your favorite failure?
Favorite failure?
Yeah, I mean the one that led you, or that really pushed you to where you are today and where the company is today.
I've had no shortage of failures. Let me see if I can think of one that off the top that resonates in some way. I mean, certainly the product I created for Microsoft, Mungo Park, was among the most exciting things that I'd ever created. But I couldn't make it work as a business, and Microsoft was a business that required every unit to be a business. I'm not sure if this is the answer you're looking for, but it was a very sad day for me when Bill Gates came and said, look, we can't continue to finance this thing. It's not making any money. We're going to move more towards the commodity side of things, which is selling air tickets and hotel rooms. So yeah, I considered that a failure. But I mean, if I sat down and thought about it, I could probably come up with a book of failures. So maybe that's the next one. So.
two short ones. What do you think is a first that you would really want to see in the next 50 years? And two, what's a sort of descent or similar travel that you think people should stop doing or do less of?
Interesting. Well, I'm certainly against mass travel, and I don't think you get much out of that. I mean, if you travel to a distant locale, let's say you go to Bali, and you check into a hotel, and you go down to the lobby and you watch a Kechik dance across the room. It entertains you, but you never meet anybody, you never talk to anybody, and you go back up to your room and you order a cheeseburger and and a glass of Italian wine or something. Unfortunately, that is a very common experience, and those sorts of Turo dollars don't go towards helping a community. They often go towards destroying a community in their own sense of identity, because often villages are cleared to make way for a resort such as this, and anything to do with what was original culture is backseated or even erased. So I would love to see people be more aware and more responsible in their travels, and that's something that we have been evangelists for, I think, since the beginning. And your other question was, what's another first? Boy, we've done a lot of firsts. Let's see. I am. This is a personal one. I feel I had a chance when we did the Euphrates River, which flows from Turkey into Syria. I had a chance to visit Syria, a culture which is the beginning of civilization. It was the cradle, the Fertile Crescent. I really wanted to cross over into Syria, but I had left my passport at the hotel. Talk about failures. So I got to the border and I couldn't cross. And I vowed, I said, I'm going to come back and I'm going to visit Syria in a very positive way. And that never happened. And I don't know if it's going to happen in my lifetime. Maybe. I would love to do that, see that. But there aren't aren't many places left that I think we haven't touched, with the eyes and legs and curiosity of the company. Yes. Oh, sorry.
How would you, is this on? How would you pre-inspect your first descents often? Would you hike the route? Would you take a helicopter? How would you organize your expedition sites and your beginnings?
Well, in the early days, and there's some of those photos I showed you at the beginnings, we had almost no money. When Geographic, which was spending $500,000 to do that expedition on the Omo, asked me how much we spent, we collectively spent about $350 to make the first descent of the Omo River. And we scrimped and saved and were able to use a bucket shop to get $150 airfares over to Africa. Where was I going with that one? I forgot. Yeah. Scouting the rivers, that's right. So the only thing we had back then were some CIA aerial photographs. My father had been a career officer at the CIA, so he was able to help us out and get some maps. But even then, they were taken so high and the detail was so limited, we really had little idea of what we were doing. So we were literally barreling downstream without understanding what might lie around the next bend, with the fear that we could be canyoned out, coming to a gorge that has sheer on both sides, and if the river is fast, what do you do? That never happened, thankfully. Now, as with, let's say, the Mystery of the Nile film, we had helicopters and we surveyed the entire thing before we went and knew exactly where we were going to stop and camp, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the way things are done today. And of course, satellite photography is spectacular now. Google Maps. So.
Do I need a mic? Yeah, just because we're live. Okay. So thank you so much. That was so really fascinating. And I'm in the tour business.
All
Like,
right.
I've been to Grand Canyon like 30 times with Europeans. But
Wow.
a lot of what you say reminds me, and it shows you how 100 and whatever many years it is, it reminds me of explorations of the Colorado River Canyon from John Wesley Powell.
Wesley Powell, yeah.
Very much. And
1869.
yeah, and I think that all of what you visited, not all, but all of these parks, I mean, I hate to sound over chauvinistic, but we really have Ulysses Grant and then President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, for the whole idea of national parks
Yep.
that, you know, was taken all over the world.
true.
And that's what you were able to benefit from in a way too.
Yes.
This is wonderful. I
Yes.
have no desire to go on these, you know, I've had enough, enough scary things happen to me, but that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. And we have a full range of activities. Not everything is class 5. So.
Where do you see the future of adventure travel heading?
I am pretty excited about adventure travel because I do think that there is a growing awareness of the fragility of the planet and cultures. And when you experience, when you taste, when you shake hands with others, that experience, that person, that wildlife becomes personal. And when it becomes personal, then you become an advocate, you become a champion for its continuation, its preservation. And we have been challenged, I think, since we started the company. When we first used the term adventure travel, I don't think it existed. And travel agents that I would knock on doors go, what is that? And that sounds like something, you know, that Thor Heyerdahl or Edmund Hillary does. You know, our clients won't do that. It was a long, slow ramp. But more and more people are endorsing and believing and understanding that this is the right way, the best way to travel, and it's a way to make a difference in a very positive, for yourself as a traveler, but for every place you touch. So I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic. I think more and more people are becoming aware and enthused. So.
We can do one more question here.
Hi, I have one last question. Did you actually bring insects back on the adventure? and also,
good question.
But also, do you partner with researchers in collecting any kind of data?
No. Yes, we brought a lot of insects back. You know, when they agreed to sponsor us as Sobek, my first question was, fantastic, how much money are you going to give us? And he said, money? No, I'm going to give you collecting equipment. And you can use the Smithsonian name. So we received no money, but we received probably 50 pounds worth of collecting equipment. And we religiously collected lots and lots of insects on our first expeditions in Ethiopia and brought them back. Dr. Spangler had said, look, if you find something that has never been seen before, we could name it after you. So I kind of like that idea. But I brought it back, delivered it. They went through it all, and they were very excited about what we brought back, but they said nothing new. So yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. All right. All right.
Thank you.
How much over did we go?
Great presentation. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you.
You'll look avidly for your especially Bhutan.
Okay, yeah, we do Bhutan.
We're wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, it was fun.
Thank you for your presentation.
Oh, great, thanks. I'll take these out there too.
I just want to say I work on crocodiles.
You do?